Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to our Veterans Day program, as we are grateful for your participation, whether you are joining us here at the Rockefeller Center or via online live stream. Today, we stand at the intersection of history and responsibility as we gather to pay tribute to those who have shown unwavering dedication to our nation's well-being. The ROTC community at Dartmouth plays a pivotal role in shaping the next generation of exceptional officers for the U.S. Army. The cadets who commissioned from Dartmouth instill our Army exceptional leadership, professionalism, and ethical decision-making, ensuring the strength and validity of our military. Here we underscore the importance of recognizing the honors of our veterans who have exemplified courage and selflessness beyond unmeasured. Our veterans volunteered to defend our Constitution and safeguard the American way of life, enduring immense sacrifices and confronting relentless mental and physical challenges throughout their service. Mental and physical challenges throughout their service, their embodiment of resilience and commitment. And today, we come together as a community to show our profound appreciation. Honoring and recognizing our veterans is not just an act of gratitude. It is a display of unity that resonates with every essence of our nation. It is a beacon that inspires future generations to contribute and serve, reminding us that bonds that unite us as Americans are unbreakable. Thank you to our event co-sponsors, the Rockefeller Center and the Dickey Center, for hosting this event and allowing the opportunity for us to recognize and honor our veterans. We would like to engage our attendees in this conversation and welcome questions towards the end of our program. For those joining us virtually, please send your questions to Rocky Question and Answer at dartmouth.edu. It is a privilege to introduce two distinguished individuals who embody the spirits of our community's dedication, education, and greater good. Dr. Matthew Delmont, the Frank J. Garani Association Dean of International Studies and Interdisciplinary Studies, and Sherman Fairchild, Distinguished Professor of History. It is an authority, African American history, and civil rights movement. He is the author of Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting in World War II. At Home and Abroad, which received the Ansfield Wolf Book Award. He is also the author of 4 provisionist books, Black Quotidian, Everyday History in African American Newspapers, Making Root, A Nation Captivated, while Bustling Failed, Race Media, and the National Resistance to School and Desegregation. And The Nicest Kids in Town, American Bandstand Rock and Roll and the Struggle for Civil Rights in 1950s in Philadelphia. He was awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship and the National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award to support this research. In addition to these books, he regularly shares his research to the media outlets, including the New York Times, NPR, and TheAtlantic.com, Washington Post, and The Conversation. Dr. Delmont has spoken and consulted with Fortune 500 companies, universities, colleges, and community organizations regarding African American history, civil rights, and how to reckon with the history of racism in America. These incredible accomplishments reflect his commitment to sharing the stories that define our nation's past and guide the future. Joining Dr. Delmont to the stage is Professor Leslie Butler, a respected member of the Dartmouth History Department. Her expertise in 19th century American culture and politics has illuminated critical aspects of our nation's development. With her insightful books, Consistent Democracy, The Woman Question, and Self-Government in 19th Century America, and Critical Americans, Victorian Intellectuals, and the Transatlantic Liberal Reform, she has enriched our understanding of American history and evolving ideals in self-government and democracy. As we welcome our guests to the stage, let us remember the importance of knowledge they impart and the role they play in shaping the leaders of tomorrow. Today, we embark on a journey of inspiration, appreciation, and reflection, united in our commitment to upholding the values that define our great nation. So with all being said, if everyone could please welcome to the stage Dr. Delmont.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the nice introduction. I want to thank Jason, Devorah, and the rest of the Rocky staff. Thank my colleague Leslie Butler for being part of the conversation this evening. The plan is I'll talk about the book for about 20 minutes, focusing on the experience of Black veterans. Then Leslie and I will have a brief conversation, and we'll open up for questions. I should also mention Leslie has a book that came out last month, Consistent Democracy, so maybe at some point we can flip the script and I'll be interviewing you about this. Thank you everyone for coming out on a presentation about Veterans Day. Right? This is a chance for us to reflect on the importance of veterans, not just today, but really throughout American history. I think many of you knew Jim Wright, former president, former history colleague, before he passed away. Thankfully, I arrived at Dartmouth just in time to have a chance to meet him, go to lunch, go to coffee, as he was finishing his most recent book. So we had a chance to talk about our shared interests in American history and military history. One thing Jim and I talked about was how you can't talk about American history without talking about the history of veterans. So that's how I want to kind of frame my comments tonight. Normally when I talk about this book, I talk about the experiences during the war, and then in the last 5 minutes talk about the experience of Black veterans. I'm going to kind of flip it tonight, talk very briefly about the experiences of Black soldiers during the war, but then give most of my time talking about Black veterans. I should say at the outset that this is an inspiring and troubling history. Right? So some of what I'm going to share is very difficult stuff, but it happened. Right? I think it's important for us to reckon today with that history. This is part of the history of veterans. So the title for my book comes from a letter that a man named James G. Thompson wrote to the Pittsburgh Courier. James Thompson was a 26-year-old in Wichita, Kansas, and he writes this letter in late December 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The letter asks a series of very pressing and pointed questions. He asks, should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Is the America I know worth defending? What he was reflecting on was, what does it mean for him and other Black Americans to be drafted into a military that's racially segregated? What does it mean to fight for, potentially die for a country that treats you as a second-class citizen? The Pittsburgh Courier was the largest and most influential Black newspaper in the country. They used Thompson's letter to launch what was called the Double Victory Campaign. That became the rallying cry for Black Americans during the war. What it stood for was victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. And it's important to understand it wasn't just a clever slogan or rhetorical device. It truly was a two-front battle for Black Americans. They understood the importance of defeating the Nazis and the Axis powers militarily, but they understood that wasn't enough. You couldn't come back home to white supremacy and racial discrimination here in the United States. And so they saw the home front as an equally important battleground. One of my favorite quotes in the book comes from Vernon Baker. During the war, there were 433 Medals of Honor awarded. None were awarded to Black troops. Thankfully, in the 1990s, the military conducted a review of the awards and promoted 7 men who had received the Distinguished Service Cross to the Medal of Honor. Vernon Baker was the only one still alive to receive that honor in person. He was 77 years old at the time. During the war, he was a first lieutenant in the 92nd Infantry. He took out 3 machine gun positions and led a battalion charge through heavy fire and enemy minefields to help the Allies capture a German mountain stronghold in Italy. He demonstrated extraordinary heroism during the war, even though it took the Army 5 decades to recognize that fact. He said when he received the Medal of Honor that I was an angry young man. We were all angry, but we had a job to do and we did it. What I like about the quote is it speaks truly to the recognition that Black troops had at that time that they were being treated unfairly. They recognized the hypocrisy of the United States claimed to be fighting for freedom and democracy while condoning Jim Crow segregation, racial discrimination, lynching here at home. This isn't just something that historians like me discovered in the last couple decades. It was palpable, visceral to Black Americans at the time. So here's what I'd say. In a normal presentation, I would talk for a half hour about all the contributions Black Americans made to the war. But let me try to boil it down to one single sentence. America and the Allies could not have won World War II without the contributions of Black troops. To give you one very small example, if you think about the D-Day invasion, June 6, 1944, D-Day just stood for Day of the Invasion. There was still D-Day plus 1, D-Day plus 2, and it was the weeks and months after June 6 that turned the tide of the war. There were about 2,000 Black Americans who landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day, but there were tens of thousands who participated in the supply effort after D-Day. The group of truck drivers, called the Red Ball Express, they moved 400,000 tons of ammunition, food, and fuel in the months after D-Day. It's what made it possible for America to storm across France and eventually into Germany. That was largely done by black men, black Americans. The reality is almost everything American allies moved to the front passed through the hands of at least one black American. So if we understand World War II not just as a battle of strategy and will, but as a battle of supply, it becomes readily apparent that America couldn't have won the war without black troops. But that's not my focus today. Black troops, when they came home, were greeted with hostility. As America was celebrating the victories of World War II, this is what James O. Eastland, a senator from Mississippi, had to say on the floor of the Senate. He said, "Negro soldiers have disgraced the flag of their country. The Negro race is an inferior race. I'm proud that the purest form of white blood flows in my veins. I know that the white race is a superior race. It has ruled the world, it has given us civilization. It's responsible for all the progress on earth." Now, if these words are upsetting us today, and they should be, imagine how they sounded to black veterans who just risked their lives, seen their buddies killed, fighting for a country that treated them as half American. They were outraged. It's also important to understand Eastland's only in the Senate because black people in Mississippi can't vote. Mississippi in 1945 is 48% black. Fewer than 2% of those black Mississippians are registered to vote because of decades of intentional voter disenfranchisement, poll taxes, and explicit violence against black voters. So Mississippi, in no meaningful sense of the term, is a democracy. If it was, Eastland wouldn't be there representing a state that's nearly half black. This is what the Double Victory Campaign was about. The war for black Americans didn't end in 1945. That generation of black veterans came back and they kept fighting. They were fighting the other half of the Double Victory Campaign. As one veteran put it, they went from fighting in the European theater of operations to fighting in the Southern theater of operations. The reason why Eastland's racism mattered is that it helped shape the policies that greeted black veterans when they came home. The best example of this is the GI Bill. The GI Bill is what made it possible for a whole generation of white veterans to be able to enter the middle class. It provided access to low-interest home mortgages, access to job training, access to college tuition benefits. There were some black Americans who were able to benefit from the GI Bill, and I'll talk about some of them here. But by and large, African Americans experienced explicit racial discrimination when they tried to access these GI Bill benefits. To give you just a couple examples, in Mississippi, only 2 of the more than 3,000 VA guaranteed home loans issued in 1947 went to black borrowers. And things were hardly better in the North. Out of 67,000 mortgages issued by the VA in New York and northern New Jersey, fewer than 100 went to black people. Nationally, by 1950, white veterans had received nearly 98% of VA guaranteed loans. There are researchers today in the economics department at Brandeis who are trying to calculate what the long-term impact of this has been. What they found is that black veterans were only able to access about 40% of the benefits that white veterans were. And what that meant over a lifetime was about a $100,000 difference. So when you look at the racial wealth gap that we have in our country today, a good chunk of that can be traced back to policy decisions that were made in the post-war period. The hardest chapter of the book for me to write was a chapter called Homecoming, where I described some of the violence that greeted black veterans when they came home. I want to read to you 4 of these stories, and this is the part where it gets hard. Right? These are men who had served their country during the war. They survived the war, but they didn't survive the peace in the United States. Eugene Bell, a father of 2 young children, was abducted and killed by a band of white men in Liberty, Mississippi. The attack was retaliation because when Bell was honorably discharged from the Army, he went to work for his father-in-law rather than returning to work as a sharecropper on a white-owned farm. John C. Jones, an honorably discharged Army corporal, was lynched by a white band in Minden, Louisiana, for allegedly sneaking into a white family's backyard. The Pittsburgh Courier's editors wrote, "Another veteran of World War II who emerged unscathed from the Holocaust has been done to death on his native soil and has gone unavenged." Maceo Snipes, an Army veteran, was confronted by 4 KKK members who came to his farmhouse the day after he became the first black person to vote in the Democratic primary in Taylor County, Georgia. Snipes was shot and killed by Edward Williamson, who is also a World War II veteran. George Dorsey, who served in the Pacific, had been home for less than a year when he his wife, Mae Murray, and their friends, Dorothy and Roger Malcolm, were shot 60 times at close range by a white mob in Walton County, Georgia. Dorsey's white landlord, who was implicated in the shooting but never charged, later said, "Up until George went into the Army, he was a good boy. But when he came out, they thought they were as good as white people." This violence against veterans was about power. It's not a coincidence that what upset so many of these white Americans was the fact that black veterans had more freedom, that they had access to resources from having served in the Army. They had access to training from having served in the Army, and they had a desire to express that freedom. That was disturbing to a lot of people. This violence against veterans was also about intimidation. It was trying to intimidate the larger black community to keep people in their place. It was also about what kind of America was going to be, the country was going to be after 1945. That's what black veterans were fighting about when they came home. They wanted a different kind of America. They didn't want to go back to the same kind of America they left in 1941. And this was evidently apparent to black Americans at the time. This is a black veteran from Monroe, Georgia, 1946. He said, "They're exterminating us. They're killing Negro veterans in Italy and Germany. In Italy and Germany, we knew which way they were coming, but not here." A young Martin Luther King Jr., 17 years old, Morehouse College. One of the first published writings he had was a letter to the editor of an Atlanta newspaper, reflecting on some of these lynchings. He said, "We want and are entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens." So the point to emphasize here is it wasn't just the veterans and their families who were hurt by this. Martin Luther King was too young to serve in the military. As far as I know, none of his close relatives served, but he was impacted by it. How could he not be? To see your cousins, your neighbors, your uncles, your aunts be threatened in this way after they had just served the country, again, it was outrageous. This is what helped to motivate the civil rights movement. So as bad as all that was, as horrific as all it was, it helped to fuel the civil rights movement that emerged in the country after World War II. That's what that generation of black veterans did. To highlight two who worked alongside Martin Luther King Jr., Hosea Williams lied about his age to join the Army when he was only 16 years old. He served in the European theater, then came home and helped to co-lead the Southern Christian Leadership Conference alongside Martin Luther King Jr. Whitney Young, on the right side, was the leader of, he was in the Army, and then became the leader of the National Urban League. He helped to co-lead the March on Washington. There were thousands of black women who served in the Army during the war as well, in the Women's Army Corps. They too went into roles helping to lead civil rights. Dovey Johnson Roundtree was in the Women's Army Corps. She used the GI Bill to earn a law degree from Howard University Law School and helped to open up a pioneering law firm in Washington, D.C., won a number of important civil rights cases, including one on behalf of another veteran, Sarah Keyes. There was a case that happened just years before the Montgomery bus boycott, before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Sarah Keyes did the same thing. She refused to give up her seat on an interstate bus that led to a very important Supreme Court decision regarding interstate bus travel and segregation. Dovey Johnson Roundtree was the lawyer, Sarah Keyes was the plaintiff. If you think about the Brown versus Board of Education decision, one of the first landmark Supreme Court decisions, one of the cases that formed the Brown versus Board of Education decision came from South Carolina. This couple, Harry and Eliza Briggs, protested school segregation in South Carolina. Harry Briggs served in the Pacific in the Navy. When he brought this case protesting school segregation, he actually lost his job as a gas attendant at a gas station. That risk of employment was one of the things that often met civil rights activists. And it was one of the 4 cases that formed Brown versus Board. I mentioned the outrageous quote from James O. Eastland earlier. Black people in Mississippi fought back. To highlight just 2 of them, Amzie Moore served in the Army during World War II, earned medals for his conduct. He helped to lead the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, to fight for voting rights in Mississippi, to make sure black people actually had access to the ballot. Aaron Henry also served in the Army. He helped to lead the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the ones who in 1964 explicitly challenged the segregationist Democratic Party from Mississippi. Probably most famously, Medgar Evers was a World War II veteran who went on to lead in the Civil Rights Movement. He was part of that Red Ball Express I mentioned earlier. He loaded cargo for those troops. He was just 19 years old when his port battalion landed on Omaha Beach just days after the D-Day invasion. On his 21st birthday in 1946, he tried to lead a group of black veterans to register to vote in Decatur, Mississippi, where he was from, only to be turned away by a white mob with guns. He said later, I had been on Omaha Beach. All we black soldiers wanted was to be ordinary citizens. We fought during the war for America, Mississippi included. Now, after the Germans and Japanese hadn't killed us, it looked as though white Mississippians would. Evers, of course, dedicated his life to fighting for civil rights. He took on increasingly important roles in the civil rights movement in Mississippi. He investigated the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955 and kept fighting for voting rights and civil rights until he was assassinated in 1963. And he's buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The last veteran I'll mention is Robert P. Madison. So one of the key sources I used for the book were a series of oral history interviews that were conducted by the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. One of the people they interviewed was Robert Madison. And I'll play a short clip from that interview in a second. Robert Madison paused his studies at Howard University to serve as a second lieutenant in the 92nd Infantry during the war, where he earned a Purple Heart in combat in Italy. After the war, he used the GI Bill to earn architectural degrees from Case Western University and Harvard, then went back to his hometown of Cleveland to open up a pioneering, trailblazing architectural firm. He worked on a number of buildings, including the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. But I want to play you a short clip of him talking about an experience of going to a bookstore later in his life.
I do believe there should be a World War II museum. Yes, no question in my mind about that. The sad thing about it, though, is that the black troops were not represented at all. I was passing through the bookstore the other day, and I saw this great big volume called World War II, and I didn't see one reference to any black soldiers or any black airmen at all in the book. The book was that thick. And I said, you know, we were a forgotten group of people. So I think there should be this museum, and I think it ought to show and represent everybody who fought in that war. And those who, when I say fight, I don't mean were in battle, but who supported it, who were the ordnance, who were the quartermaster corps, who were the cooks, who were all that sort of thing. It ought to be there, because that is a record. That's our history. Yes, I do believe so.
That quote, "We were a forgotten group of people." It's one of the things that motivated me to write this book. I had a chance to meet Mr. Madison earlier this fall in Cleveland, where he's from. I want to play another short clip of him being acknowledged by the crowd there.
I want to start by telling you the thing I tell my students in the classroom all the time. The stories we tell about the past matter. Today, there are fewer than 120,000 living American World War II veterans, including approximately 10,000 black veterans. I'd like to start by talking about one of them, who happens to be a Clevelander, who happens to be here with us this evening, Robert P. Madison.
Mr. Madison is 100 years old. Right? Can you imagine? I've given, at this point, probably 50 talks on the book, and that was definitely a highlight of the year of my life, honestly. 100 years old, this isn't that long ago. Right? I think that's one thing I try to impress on our students all the time, is that this history is not that long ago. One of the challenges that Leslie and I and other historians have is to try to put ourselves in the shoes of people who lived in the past. And so part of the challenge of writing this book is try to understand what people of Mr. Madison's generation experienced, not just during the war, but after the war. So let me conclude by saying I wrote this book for veterans like Robert Madison, W. Johnson Roundtree, Medgar Evers, who never stopped fighting for America. These are the stories I want us to lift up on this Veterans Day. Thanks. Look forward to talking with Leslie.
Hi, everyone. Is this on? Okay, yeah. Thank you, Matt, for that really wonderful talk and for the book, which is just a lovely work of history and a great read. So if you haven't yet bought it, your local bookstore, Still North, actually selling around it there. So we will be opening to the floor in just a bit, but I thought we'd start by having a little bit of a discussion. I had some questions for you. One that I just thought would be sort of a more of general interest question is really to think about the research that went into the book. I do recall seeing you with a group of students in the little hub in the second floor of Carson, right?
Yep.
So as you would probably imagine, National Archives, military documents are crucial to any story about World War II, but for your story in particular, the Black Press is everywhere in this book. And so could you talk a little bit, I know you're very familiar with the Black Press, you used it for your Black Quotidian book as well, but what was that research like? What was it like working with the students and organizing it?
Yeah. Thanks for starting there. I think historians' favorite thing to talk about is evidence and sources. So yes, the Black Press was absolutely crucial to this book. For folks who aren't familiar, Black newspaper is really the lifeblood of Black communities. Papers like Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, Baltimore African American, many of which are still around today in different formats, but in the 1940s, 50s, these were the hubs. If you looked at a mainstream white newspaper, you'd have hardly any idea that there were more than 1 million Black men and women serving in World War II. But it was every day in the pages of these Black newspapers. I worked with more than a dozen undergraduate research assistants here at Dartmouth on the project. One thing we have access to by virtue of being at a research institution is a tremendous database that we have access to through the library called the ProQuest Historical Newspaper Database. You can go back to your offices, your dorm rooms, and find it. It allows you to be able to search through keywords these historical newspapers that I worked with. And so the team of RAs and I, we would be able to look at the Chicago Defender from 1943 and see how the Army, the Marine Corps, the Navy was being described, see how these papers responded after Pearl Harbor. What's important about those is it gives you sort of at the time responses to how Black Americans were responding to the war as it was unfolding. And they're the kind of stories that, again, don't show up typically in our textbooks, in historical documentaries, in part because that's not where a lot of white journalists, white commentators, white academics were looking at the time. A number of these Black newspapers had war correspondents who were embedded with Black units. So I mentioned the Red Ball Express earlier. Those kind of units had war correspondents who were there writing about them, so be able to use those kind of stories. In taking a step back, Black Quotidian is the project that came before this. You can find it at blackquotidian.org. It was a digital book project. It's part of what sparked my research my interest in this history, because I was going through these newspapers from the war years, and I kept coming across pictures and stories about Black veterans, Black soldiers and sailors serving during the war. And it was more examples of this than I'd ever seen before. And so it was really that curiosity that sparked the research process that resulted in the book.
And how much of that is digitized? In the 19th century, it's really spotty, so I'm curious, like you were able to do everything through ProQuest, pretty much?
For this, yes. I mean, they've digitized, for these 12 newspapers that we have access to, pretty much every edition that's available. And so almost everything from 1915 up through the 1970s, we have access to digitally. And so tens and tens of thousands of sources. And I mean, as you know, what historians love is a wealth of sources to then start to put the puzzle pieces together, right? And try to flesh out stories that have not been told as fully as they should. And so I can't speak highly enough to that as a source. And for students, you can use it in any of your history classes or African American studies classes.
I know, and even Langston Hughes was a war correspondent. That was thrilling to me. I teach Langston Hughes in other contexts, but that was, it's a lot of people that you'll never even recover the names of necessarily, but then also he was sort of embedded in Spain, right, a little bit?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a key part of the book is that for Black Americans, World War II starts before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, because they're really attuned to the rise of fascism in the 1930s. It shows up a lot in Black newspapers. Langston Hughes, the famous poet and writer, becomes a war correspondent for the Baltimore African American, actually travels to Spain to report on these 80 Black volunteers who were part of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade fighting fascism in Spain. This is 1936, 37. And so these are things that average Black people are talking about at barbershops, after church, right? They're talking about fascism as something that isn't just a European problem, but something that Americans have to really pay attention to.
Mm-hmm. And they're seeing this connection between racial systems. The whole history, this whole idea of the half American, that poignant letter to the Philadelphia Courier, I mean, it is poignant because when I read it, I'm a 19th century historian, it just made me think of this terribly long and difficult struggle for citizenship claims that exist throughout every decade, but they really get articulated during wartime pretty powerfully, right? We can think of going back to the Revolutionary War, but certainly during the Civil War, where in the short term they seem quite successful, right? The 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, citizenship is granted, black manhood suffrage is granted in the short term. World War I, W.B. Du Bois is a really powerful voice in insisting that if black Americans enter the war, the peace will be on more equal terms. And then, of course, here we are in this situation. So I wonder if you could think a little bit about that linkage between, especially on Veterans Day, between citizenship and wartime, citizenship and service, and sort of both it's the leverage it gives a group of people, but maybe also the constraints that it imposes on those claims.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, as you rightly note, part of the reason the Double Victory campaign resonated so powerfully is that it was actually a very old idea. It was a new way of framing something that had been deeply part of black history. Frederick Douglass, in the context of the Civil War, says very similar things about we're going to fight in this war, but then we want freedom afterwards. Du Bois, as you mentioned, sort of talks about we're going to return fighting, right? We're going to do this, but then we want something on the other side of it. In each of those cases, black people didn't get what they were fighting for. Right? There's still this outheld hope for civil rights, for freedom, for democracy. I think part of the reason it resonates so powerfully is that military service has long been the kind of core focal point about what it means to be fully American, to be an American citizen. It represents patriotism. Black people wanted to be part of that. They wanted to share in that sense of citizenship. I think one of the constraints it placed is that those periods of war were often bracketed. And so the contributions black people could make were welcome during the war years, but then once the crisis was averted or gotten past, the ability to use that as leverage dissipated. But I think part of what this generation took away was using the war as a foundation to advance those claims for civil rights. I think that's one of the things I find inspiring about this story is that it links patriotism and dissent. Right? It doesn't see patriotism and dissent as opposite ends of a spectrum, but it says if you really care about this country, you have to fight to make it a better country. You have to fight to make it a place that truly values democracy. Right? That's a really difficult and challenging version of patriotism, but it's one that flowed through what that generation of black veterans, and I think what black Americans have long felt, is needed to keep the country moving in a better direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a sort of moral clarity that comes with that process. Do you have like a favorite discovery, some story? I mean, you told that's a pretty hard to top story where you actually got to meet the 100-year-old veteran. There were a few that I really liked, but is there one that you're just like, oh, this story must be told, and you were super excited to tell it?
There are a bunch, yeah.
I know, can you one for people who haven't yet read the book?
So I think the one I'll highlight, there's a soldier named Edward Allen Carter Jr. That if I had to highlight the most interesting person to fight in World War II, he would get my vote. He was raised by black missionary parents in India and China, and so he was fluent in Hindi, Mandarin, and German. At 15, he left home to serve in the Chinese National Army to fight against Japanese incursions in Shanghai. He was one of the volunteers in the Spanish Civil War, and all that's before he turned 21. Right? And so in the months before Pearl Harbor, he volunteers for the Army, and you would think with this advanced language skill and the combat experience, the Army would have a good role for him. But instead, they assigned him to be a cook in a quartermaster unit. Which I think really speaks to the illogic of segregation. I didn't say much about it here, but segregation made no sense for a military that was trying to fight and win a global war. There's no strategic or tactical reason for it. It was actually wasteful and redundant. It made the military less effective. That's why they got rid of it. But nevertheless, he was in that capacity. But he served as a cook until 1944 when the Army was desperate for more infantry troops. And so they issued a call for volunteers. Carter was one of the 5,000 that answered that call. Right? He ends up getting assigned to a division under General Patton, and ends up being one of the people who earns the Medal of Honor posthumously because he carries out this tremendous raid against German troops as they're about to cross the Rhine River. He's pinned down, 8 troops come to capture him. He ends up popping up, killing 6 of the German troops, captures the remaining 2. And then I mentioned before, he is fluent in German, so he interrogates the 2 troops he captured in German as leading them back across the field, getting intelligence that he gives to his commander, helping to save American lives. It sounds like Hollywood movie stuff, but he actually did it, right? And so I think what's important about that story is one can only imagine how many other men and women like Edward Carter there were, right, who had the capabilities to help America and the Allies win the war quicker, but whose talents weren't taken advantage of because the Army was only focused on the color of someone's skin.
Right. Now that does sound like a biography and selling the movie rights for sure, so I expect to see that in 3 short years. There's a real moral urgency to the way you frame the book in the introduction and the conclusion, and you touched on a little bit here. Just how much history and memory, the way we remember our history, how much it matters. We're living in a moment where that's a highly politicized conversation, right? We hear about this all the time. But there's something just really troubling about white America's very selective amnesia, I would say about the Black experience generally, but particular about this story, about Black contributions to World War II, because that memory is so good war. It's such an important memory to sort of national understanding, and the place of Black Americans in it is really, as you say, until this book has been, minimally visible. And I would say not just actually even the experience during the war, but the constant protesting of their treatment during the war, right? I mean, it's at every turn. You've got Thurgood Marshall involved. All the leaders that you've heard of are involved in the wartime as well as after. Could you elaborate on that a little bit, on how important this story is at this moment in 2023 to really getting the history and the memory right for sort of understanding the world we live in and thinking about how to move forward?
Yeah. So the reason in that last clip I said the stories we tell about the past matter is that that's how I understand history. I think if we don't reckon honestly with history, then we really have no idea how to understand what's going on in the world today. Right? And we don't have the luxury of being ignorant of these things. Those murders of the veterans I talked about, that chapter Homecoming, I was writing that in the summer of 2020, while there were the nationwide protests of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. To be honest, there was a feeling of helplessness, right? So I'm writing about people who were murdered in 45, 46, 47, very similar circumstances, often these altercations with sheriffs or police, and the activists were using very similar methods. Rather than social media, they had Black newspapers. They were trying to say the names of these victims, trying to call attention to it, trying to get the UN to issue a human rights claim about what was going on in America. As historians, it's frustrating when you get this feeling that America either is unwilling to or doesn't want to learn from its past. Right? Like, what's the point of trying to bring these stories back to the foreground if we're never going to learn from them? But I think the reason it's important is that if we understand that the World War II era was not some kinder, simpler, more peaceful time, right? It was fraught, right? People sometimes talk today about how America's more divided today than ever was in the past. Like, not true, right? Absolutely not true.
There was a civil war.
There is no simple, unified part of American history we can return to, right? It has always been so, right? And we have to deal with that honestly, right? There's definitely been progress, don't get me wrong on that, but our inability to reckon with the reality of what was going on in World War II, the reality of the violence that Black veterans encountered, helped to lead to some people being surprised when George Floyd and other people were being killed. Right? We don't have the luxury of being surprised by that. If you understand anything about American history, you have to understand that this violence has been a constant. Right? And so that's what I think motivates me to do this kind of history. But also, so it makes me scared about a lot of the contemporary debates about how we should and should not teach history. That I think some people would rather focus only on happy stories,
Right.
And that's not our responsibility. Right? Our responsibility is to tell the truth in public, right? And that requires careful research and evidence. Right? The things I read about in the book are true regardless of whether President Biden's in the White House or Trump or Bush or Obama, whoever's in the White House in the future. Right? Historians, we're boring people by nature. Right? We're trying to do sort of deep historical research to help average citizens make sense of like where we are as a country, where we might go in the future. Right? We're not trying to get on cable news and shout at each other. And so when I talk with different audiences, I try to emphasize like history is messy, right? It's complicated. It doesn't offer easy solutions or answers, and that's why it's awesome, right? That our obligation as citizens, as people who care about the country today, is to engage honestly with this material, right? And figure out how it can help us hopefully not have to live through the same things over and over and over again.
And if we do, we can at least see a pattern.
Yeah.
No, it is. I think that's very clear the way you frame it in really powerful ways. I think we should open to the audience. I'm sure people have questions. As much as I love seeing my colleague Matt, who I never get to see anymore.
I think there's a microphone in back, so if you raise your hand,
And
they'll bring the
someone's also
microphone
manning
so
the
folks can hear you.
live stream too, correct?
Hey, Matt, thanks for all this. This is great. How directly did the Double Victory campaign, like, what is the connection between that and desegregation of the military, which happened not that long after that? And did these vets then provide, like, were they leadership that during that process of desegregation? Were they an integral part to that? And I suspect that's a whole other book. But do you get into that in your book at all?
Thanks, Jim, for coming in for the question. I get into it briefly in the book, but there is a connection there. So I think the Double Victory Campaign, important to understand, it's kind of an umbrella under which a lot of different activist movements were happening in Black America. And so there is a through line because Black Americans were calling for the desegregation of the military before World War II, during World War II, and then after World War II. They weren't successful in getting it done before the war or during the war, but by 1948, they're able to bring enough political pressure on President Truman that he signs an executive order that desegregates the military. And I think it's really an important moment, right? If it was just up to popular vote, the military would not have been desegregated. But President Truman recognized Black political power. He recognized some of the violence that Black veterans were encountering, which upset him as a veteran himself. And he, I think, did the right thing. He showed leadership to get it done. And then he actually held military leaders to account, right? Initially, the leader of the Army didn't want to desegregate the Army, and so Truman got rid of him after 6 months, right? It took till the end of the Korean War in 1953 for the military to be fully integrated. There were still challenges, but it put the military on a more forward-looking perspective with regards to racial equality. But it only came through protest and activism, right? It was consistent demands. A. Philip Randolph, the labor leader, Thurgood Marshall and NAACP, like everyone was pushing to get this done. And then the Black veterans, they did play a role in two ways. One, those who weren't in the military any longer were activists pushing for it. And then a number of, I mean, I guess they weren't veterans at this point, they re-upped after the war and stayed in the military and became some of the first officers to help lead desegregation. They showed it was possible. I think the performance of Black troops during the war helped military leaders who were previously on the fence about desegregation recognize, you know, we're going to be a more effective fighting force if we do it, right? And there was enough of that sense that that they eventually got there.
Sort of an interesting longer history about racial mobility in the military there too, right? That you know goes on. That it's you may think of the military as one of the least democratic organizations in that it thrives on hierarchy, right? That's how it's built. But yet they're able to do things in a way that the messiness of popular government doesn't allow other places to do, maybe. So it's an interesting little irony.
Matt, congratulations. This maybe isn't fair because it's other time periods, but did the experiences of the Black veterans after World War II affect recruiting for Korea and then for Vietnam, and were the veterans in those wars? I mean, did they have similar experiences? I mean, I certainly hear or have watched in many movies and read of the, you know, in the 60s for Vietnam, there was a big argument, like, why are we going and fighting against these people we have no truck with when here we don't have civil rights? So how did that experience sort of play forward?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So it might seem paradoxical given everything I just described, but Black troops from World War II actually re-enlisted at a higher percentage than white troops did. Which says something about the military, but I think says more about the private sector and what possibilities were there in America. But I think focusing on the military side, once the desegregation happens in 1948, relatively speaking, there are more opportunities there for Black Americans in the military. And so, again, I don't want to say things were perfect, but you see more Black troops serving in Korea in more roles, both in terms of more combat experience, more across the different branches, but also more officers. Right? So that was, by and large, a positive. By Vietnam, then the numbers have really jumped. By 65, the military is rightly patting itself on the back that it's the most racially integrated institution in American society. Right? It is light years ahead of higher education at that time period, or most of corporate America, in part because they need to be. I think that's one of the kind of through-line stories, is that the military needs to be able to draw on a larger demographic of American society than Dartmouth does, or Goldman Sachs, or IBM, or whatever it is, right? And so I think that has forced them to think longer and harder about racial equity than a lot of other organizations have. I'm actually working on a book on Vietnam right now, and so in 3 years I'll have more to say probably on this piece, but I think the short version is the numbers of Black troops increase pretty dramatically. They're serving above their percentage of the population. The story is mixed. Units are integrated. Generally the story is once they're in combat, things get along pretty well because people are focused on the task at hand. Problems emerge when there's downtime. And so there's a lot of racism that still existed in the camps, and there were protests on Navy ships, at jails, at military camps. There were still white troops flying Confederate flags, sort of that kind of day-to-day racism. But still, then after Vietnam, 1973, military becomes all volunteer. From that point forward, Black Americans have always served above their percentage of the population, right? Which again is about partly the private sector and what other opportunities are there.
Could you talk about the Tuskegee experiment and why it was undertaken and how it related to the war?
Yeah. So the Tuskegee Airmen are probably, I think, the best known group to serve in World War II, the group of trailblazing Black pilots. The person I focus on in the book is Benjamin O. Davis, Jr.
About the experiment.
Oh, sorry. So the experiment is actually distinct from the Tuskegee Airmen, and so it doesn't have a real relationship to World War II necessarily. Yep, it's you're right to have the misunderstanding, because it's the same place, Tuskegee, but it's not actually related to the airmen or the war. Thanks for clarifying.
So talk about the airmen, because
Yeah.
It's a good story.
I was trying to silently elect. So the airman, the person I focus on in the book is Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who graduated from West Point in 1936. He was the first Black graduate from West Point in the 20th century, only the fourth overall. He wanted to be a pilot, but when he graduated in 36, the Army had no idea what to do with him because they weren't allowing any Black men to be pilots. Through, again, Black protest, the Army finally relents and establishes an Army Air Corps training base in Tuskegee, Alabama in 1941, and Benjamin O. Davis becomes the leader of that squadron. One thing that I learned in the course of doing the research was just how challenging it was on a week-to-week, month-by-month basis. I think it's easy to tell the Tuskegee Airmen story as these guys came in, they experienced racism, they broke down barriers, and poof, success. But it was a series of sort of one step forward, two steps back, that they were training constantly. They had to prove to their white commanding officers that they could perform in combat. Even once they got in combat, some of their commanding officers tried to undercut them with their after-action reports, but yet they pushed through that. The other piece that I learned is that it wasn't just the pilots, that there were hundreds of mechanics, there were hundreds of Black women who were nurses at Tuskegee, there were meteorologists who had training from places like MIT, all Black meteorologists. And so there's this whole world of Black excellence that took shape at Tuskegee that was new to me.
What did like Black soldiers look like in the U.S. Army before World War II? Like sort of pre-Pearl Harbor and like before we have this mass conscription, like what was this sort of experience of Black soldiers, and how did that like go into World War II and maybe change during the war, or did it kind of stay the same?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I'm going to take it back just a couple decades. World War I, more than 300,000 Black Americans served in the war, right? There's always been a long tradition of Black military service. But between World War I and World War II, the Army and the military does almost everything they can to push Black Americans out of the service. There's a document I quote in the book from 1925, the Army War College Report, that has all this like, crazy racial pseudoscience and racist beliefs that really shape the perceptions of that generation of white officers. They're saying that Black troops are scared of the dark, that they'll flee from combat, that they have a smaller cranial capacity, right? But this is not just some random teachings, like they're teaching us at West Point and like in the officer candidate schools. But it shapes how the Army thinks about Black soldiers, right? It leads them to think that they don't have the intelligence, bravery, or courage to be able to serve. And so the percentage of Black Americans in the military actually declines between World War I and World War II. And so on the eve of World War II, the first thing that these Black newspapers and civil rights activists have to do is fight for the opportunity to fight, which again seems paradoxical, but they have to sort of fight, just have the opportunity to be able to serve in the military. So I think the common experiences were, by and large, not in combat units, usually in the kind of supply, logistical roles, quartermaster unit engineer, and often given the hardest and dirtiest work to do. Once the war starts, then the military has to build out these units. And so there's stories in the book about after Pearl Harbor, all of these Black Americans go to volunteer, but a lot of them are turned away because the Army and the Navy don't yet have enough all-Black units to accommodate them. And so then the goal is to basically create a quota, like can they get up to 10%? And so that's by 42, they get there. And so I think, as Leslie mentioned, then the story throughout the war is consistent efforts to increase the the capacity of what Black Americans can do and make sure that they're treated right. I think that was one of the hardest things to read about, is how poorly Black troops are treated while in service, while training. They're at these military training bases in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, and they're writing letters to Thurgood Marshall and other people saying, we fear for our lives here in the United States. Right? They're eager to get deployed to Europe or the Pacific because they feel they'll be safer there than they are in the US.
I have a question for the Dartmouth professor.
Which one?
Are you both professors?
Yeah, yep.
I didn't realize that.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
So I have a question then for both of you.
Okay.
When you're talking about World War II, and if you do talk about Black Americans, soldiers, do you get much feedback from your students? Do you cover this sort of a thing? Certainly you do, but I guess what I'm saying is there is a longer story here, and it's not just World War II, and it's not just people the age of most of us in this audience, but it's the future as well. And I'm just wondering how that message is getting through.
I mean, I would say the longer history is more what I teach than World War II. Same sets of issues in answer to your question. The fighting for the right to fight during the American Civil War was huge. Frederick Douglass was pressuring Lincoln. Lots of Black leaders are pressuring President Lincoln to allow Black troops to form. And when they finally did get formed, they had white officers. That's maybe not surprising in the 19th century, but they also weren't paid the same. And so everything was a fight, everything's a struggle. And so I think that history of struggle and fight, a lot of which is invisible. I mean, I think that's what Matt's book is so important, not just for showing wartime contributions, but for how important the resistance and the struggle has always been. And then it does help you see a larger pattern. I mean, I think the long Black freedom struggle, once you actually really know the history, it just helps you contextualize every moment, 2020, whatever. I also teach a class on voting rights, and looking at that long history of the battle for voting rights, that it's not something that pops up in the 1960s. You know, it's just this ongoing struggle that's kind of local resistance everywhere. I think students do, they really, I think they kind of get that, and they see it as sort of being able to like then slot in, oh, there is a much larger world. That's another reason that biography I think works so well too, is because history can kind of seem like these discrete moments, but when you tell it through people's lives, you start to see how not very far away things are, how close in time, that someone who, especially the example you gave, Carter, was that his name?
Yeah.
I mean, that someone who could have fought in the Spanish-American War could still be then around. And you know, these are discrete moments, different weeks on the syllabus, and yet within a span of one person's life, these can all, and that you bring those expectations and that disappointment, you bring that to each new period, right? So it's not just that they were alive in the time, but they remembered the struggle. The Black veterans, the Black soldiers in this, A. Philip Randolph, all these leaders remember the struggle from World War I, right? And their parents remembered the struggle from the 1890s, and they remembered the struggle from the 1860s. So I think that's one of the really great benefits of teaching history, I think, is to see that larger pattern.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it makes a really strong case for the kind of curricular mapping that we try to do. Right? So it's not just one class, but you try to see the continuities. I think to pick up on some of what Leslie said, and don't tell our other colleagues this, I didn't love history as a high school student or as an undergrad. Not that I didn't have good teachers, but I thought it was like memorization of dates and places and names and things. But that's not what history is about, right? It's more like detective work. It's like trying to do the research to put together these puzzle pieces and like figure out how these stories happened. History is also about people, right? It's people who are situated in situations very much like ours, where things can seem confusing and scary and overwhelming, but they had to try to make their way in an unpredictable world. Right? And those are the kind of tools that history can help provide students. And so I try to do a lot of assignments where students will find historical evidence, documents, things like these Black newspaper articles, but then try to make connections to the present in some way to get a sense of like, why does this matter, right? There's so many things we could be talking about historically. Why talk about this among all the things? I think with this history, I mean, I'm always struck by how young these people are, right? Medgar Evers was 19 years old. These men and women are 19, 20 years, they were our students' age, right? Or think about today, there's the lawsuit that's being brought against the service academies trying to ban affirmative action or consideration of race at West Point, Annapolis, and Air Force Academy. Our colleague in government, Jason Lau, is one of the expert witnesses on that.
Just the service academies.
Well, they already succeeded with everywhere else, right? And so, like, there are very clear connections. I think trying to bring those alive to students is really important.
Sorry, I had another question. You brought up the connection to fighting fascism explicitly, and I'm kind of curious in the newspapers that you were looking back on. I mean, was that connection made in editorials, and was that an inspiration telling people to sign up for that? And more pointedly, did people point to the experience of the Jews under fascism in Europe as some kind of example of what fascism does? I mean, or could do to officially second-class citizens?
Yes. So in the longer presentation, I definitely talk about that history. And so if you look at black newspapers from 1933, 34, 35, you see extensive coverage of the rise of Nazism in Germany and what Hitler is doing to the Jewish population there. Every time a new policy or event happens, whether it's the segregation of Jews on train cars, theft of Jewish property, violence against Jewish communities, all that shows up in black newspapers. And part of the reason black people recognize that earlier than other Americans, other non-Jewish Americans, is that they see parallels between fascism in Europe, Nazism, and the kind of white supremacy that exists in the Jim Crow South. And they're explicitly calling that out. They understand as early as 33 that Hitler is drawing on American racial policies to justify his treatment of Jews in Europe. And so there's a strong sense, you see a lot more in the black press than you do in white newspapers, of not only is this happening, but this is something that we need to pay attention to. This isn't just a Jewish problem or a European problem. This is something that matters to the world because fascism can't be isolated in this one space. We're experiencing something very similar to it here in the United States. And that's part of what motivated, I mentioned earlier, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. There were about 3,000 Americans who served, 2/3 of them were Jewish, about 80 were black. Among the black Americans, they'd never been to Spain before. These are average people from Alabama, Chicago, Mississippi, but they understood that someone had to fight against fascism, right? Once the Spanish Civil War starts and Hitler and Mussolini are aiding Franco and the fascists in Spain, they see that as something that needs to be fought against, right? And they see it, Leslie mentioned moral clarity. There's a moral clarity there that wasn't necessarily there for average white Americans. And I think fast forward through the war, my favorite thing about being a historian is that you learn new things in the course of research. The public polling in like 43, 44, asking average Americans, again, average white Americans who aren't Jewish, what are we fighting for? People didn't really know, right? They wanted revenge against the Japanese, but what was going on in Europe? There wasn't a clear sense. I mean, there's a retroactive sense that obviously the Holocaust is something that America was trying to stop, but that's not the reality at the time, right? That wasn't something that motivated America out of isolationism. So average white soldiers, average white Americans didn't have that sort of clarity of like why we're fighting this war, which is why the Double Victory campaign was so important, right? It was crystal clear to most average black Americans why this war had to be fought. That Nazism and fascism had to be defeated, but also we had to defeat white supremacy at home.
And one thing you didn't talk about in the presentation, but Matt talks a lot about in the book, is the race riots during the war, right? So Langston Hughes, one of his most famous poems actually is written in the wake of the Detroit race riot of 1943. And there he's explicitly linking Hitler and Jim Crow as like two figures who are linked in this way. It's a very powerful poem.
Yeah.
Great time. Oh, we're good? One more question or are we done? One more question, sorry, quickly. Okay, I think we're going to end it there. Thank you so much for coming out on this very wintry day. And thank you to our men in the uniform right here. Thanks very much, and thank you to Matt Delmont.
Thank you.